Welcome to the winter quarter MENA Conversation, hosted by the Northwestern Middle East and North African Studies program. I'm Rebecca Johnson, I direct the program. And this is a series aimed at elucidating points of intersection, as well as tension between Middle East studies and neighboring or cognate fields, including African studies, Asian American studies, Black studies, critical Muslim studies, and how those junctures between fields traditionally seen as separate, in fact, elucidate those vital questions and problems in Middle East studies itself. Today's conversations brings together scholars of race and racialization in the MENA region with those working on the racialization of MENA and Muslim peoples in the diaspora, both in the US and elsewhere. The event is designed to help us think critically about the way that those histories and experiences of racialization mutually elucidate each other. How do they intersect or not? Should we as scholars find ways of thinking them together or holding them apart? We have the privilege of hosting three scholars to speak today, whom I'm going to briefly introduce. Sadek Sheikh is the director of the Global Justice Program at the Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of California, Berkeley, where he oversees the program's projects on corporate power, food systems, forced migration, inclusiveness index, Islamophobia, and human rights mechanisms. And he also manages the Shahidi Project and the Nile Project. Previously, Sadek led an international program at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at Ohio State University, where he also served as an associate editor of the Institute's journal, Race, Ethnicity, Multidisciplinary Global Contexts. Next will speak Nadine Naber, who's a professor of Gender and Women's Studies program at the Global Asian Studies program, and is also the interim director of the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Nadine is the author of Arab America, Gender, Cultural Politics, and Activism, and the co-editor of the books Race and Arab Americans, Arab and Arab American Feminisms, and The Color of Violence. Nadine is a board member of the Arab American Action Network and co-founder of the organization Mamas Activating Movements for Abolition and Solidarity, and is the founder of Liberate Your Research. Finally, Junaid Rana is an anthropologist who writes about global capitalism, diaspora racism, and social protest movements. He's an associate professor of Asian American Studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, with appointments in the Department of Anthropology, the Center for South Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, and the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory. He's the author of Terrifying Muslims, Race and Labor in the South Asian Diaspora, which is the 2013 winner of the Association of Asian American Studies Book Award in the Social Sciences. He is the co-editor of With Stones in Our Hands, Writing on Muslims, Racism, and Empire, and also for the University of Minnesota Press, he's the editor of the Muslim International series. He served as the inaugural editor of the Critical Ethnic Studies Journal, the journal of the Critical Ethnic Studies Association. And currently he's the associate editor of the journal Transforming Anthropology. And moderating today is Marwan Kredi. I'm very happy to say Marwan Kredi is the Dean and CEO of Northwestern University in Qatar and the Anthony Shadid Chair in Global Media, Politics, and Culture at Northwestern University. He's a fellow of the International Communication Association. He was the founding director of the Center for Advanced Research in Global Communication and associate dean for administration at the Annenberg School for Communication, University of Pennsylvania. He's the recipient of Andrew Carnegie, Guggenheim, NEH, ACLS, Woodrow Wilson, and NIAS fellowships. And Kredi has published 130 and more essays and 13 books, notably Hybridity or the Cultural Logic of Globalization, and Reality Television and Arab Politics, which won 3 leading prizes, and also The Naked Blogger of Cairo, Creative Insurgency in the Arab World, which won 3 major awards. He's a member of the board of directors of the American Council of Women's Societies in New York, the International Advisory Board of the Center for American Studies and Research at the American University of Beirut, and the board of advisors of the Center for Advanced Research in Global Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. He also tweets at mkredi. Thank you so much, Nadine Kredi, and thank you to our panelists for coming to join us today. I welcome you to start your opening remarks, and we decided we would have Sadek would start with her remarks, and then Nadine Naber, and then Junaid Rana, and we'd have a conversation amongst themselves. And then afterwards, we'll invite our attendees to post questions and answer the questions to the Q&A, and we will look forward to that conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Johnson. It's a real pleasure to join you. This is a very, very important conversation, and I'm very, very happy and proud to be part of it, thanks to you. What we're going to do, as Professor Johnson just mentioned, we'll ask our panelists to speak for 5 to 10 minutes at the beginning, then ask them to give brief responses to each other, and then hopefully we'll have a free-flowing conversation afterwards. So without further ado, I would like to invite Al-Sadiq to speak.
Hello, everybody, and many thanks to Rebecca and Marwan and the Northwestern Middle East and North African Institute for African Studies for organizing this important platform. And I'm really pleased and honored to be in the company of wonderful scholar Nadine and Junaid. I'm looking for a lively conversation with you all and with the audience. So very quick about me. I born in Sudan, and I grew up in Greece, and a couple of years back I migrated to the United States. So I attribute my understanding of and racialization based on my own personal experience that span the 3 continents, whether Africa or Europe or North America. I duly appreciate the question or opening of what category do we should use to understand race and racialization as related to MENA regions and the Muslim community. But before that, I would like just to offer a readout and just to put it in front of everybody of 2 concepts that most likely all of us will be using, but I will be using at least. Those are institutional racism and structural racism, with the difference between them and how they played out. So, so this is just a readout for our audience, just to be all of us in the same page. Institutional racism refers to the set of policy and practices within and across institutions that intentionally set to produce racialized outcome, or to put a racial group at a disadvantage. Example of institutional racism would be found in the treatment of African American during Jim Crow, for example, the policy of apartheid in South Africa, and the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories. But there is many others. On the other hand, structural racism or structural racialization or systemic racism, we use them interchangeably, refer to the system in which public policy, institutional practice, cultural representation, and other norms work in different but often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. It identifies dimensions of our history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness, and here just footnote, whiteness doesn't mean white people, and disadvantages associated with color to endure and adapt over time. Structural racism is not something that a few people or an institution choose to practice. Instead, it is a feature of the social, economic, and political systems in which we all exist and live and work. In that sense, historically marginalized groups in both, for example, MENA regions and in the United States continue to live under the social impact of structural racism with different degree and acknowledgement. So we don't all suffer the same way from structural racism or systemic racism, but we all experience it around us. So now back to the main theme. So first, it is true there is a difference between the concept of race here in the United States and in the MENA region, due to the salient feature of racial formation of the United States, with enshrined in the history of slavery, institutional racism, and structural racism. And today, racial equity and racial prejudice against Black and other communities of colors, including state-sanctioned violence, prison to school pipelines, and unequal access to opportunity, among other social impact policies. This is to say that racial equity and racial prejudice we see today are both a direct result of racial formation of the United States. Second, It's also true that the struggle against racism has been developed differently in each society. By society, I mean MENA and United States. And in this context, countries in MENA regions have all experienced different type of racialization and also experienced debates in relation to racism and the race question. Third, also we need to underscore that anti-Black racism everywhere has been built into two fundamental premises of material conditions. Is territorial control and free labor. And territorial control include human and natural resources, and the labor and free labor is forced to guarantee and to maximize individual and societal financial profits. Both territorial control and free labor are distinct features of racial capitalism that to justify subjugation of people and the natural world for the bottom line of maximized profits. So I will go even further to argue that it is extremely difficult to imagine the existence of anti-Black racism in the absence of racial capitalism. This observation is true almost everywhere in the world and during any time period. And our current moment and our region is no exception. I'm sorry, just to, by our regions, I mean a region. That being said, and to come back to the main theme, I would say that it has similar genealogy, both of them, and outcomes to the other parts of the world. One, the origin of anti-Black racism in MENA region is ancient, meaning that the history of anti-Black racism in the regions goes back as far as the history of slavery in the region itself. For example, the region has embarked on such practices since the Indian Ocean slavery in about 600 AD, which is preceded the transatlantic slavery by almost 1,000 years, which is started about 1600, and ended 100 years later after the official ban of Western slavery. Two, the origin of anti-Black racism in our region is also colonial. Both during the Ottoman and the European colonization of the region, slavery and thus anti-Black racism has intensified because it was beneficial to both local administrative elite and colonial elite and society at the time. And one concept also is worth noticing is Eurocentrism. Eurocentrism of understanding the world has also contributed to this colonial aspect of invention of race and anti-Black racism. So we ought to understand that anti-Black racism is related to other racial violence directed toward indigenous peoples everywhere and in the service of a global capitalist project. Also, we need to be able to see that all stages of capitalist development that emerged in the past 5 centuries through the experience of slavery, colonialism, imperialism, and in the present day, neoliberalism. I'm sorry if I'm throwing jargon at you, but my assumption is those jargons are quietly understood. Otherwise, I will be more than happy to talk about them. Those experiences are the ingredients of white supremacy and whiteness that continue to reproduce racial prejudice and racial violence. So you see anti-Black racism and racial violence in our today's society stemmed from a long history of capitalist development itself, and it is intertwined with the history of European colonialism, settler colonialism, imperialism, and the 20th century's globalized neoliberalism. So think of the colonial scramble for Africa, for example, of natural resources that led to the slave trade, among other devastation, or the racial violence against Afro-Brazilian, or the racial violence against the Roma people in Europe, or the racial violence against the Rohingya in Myanmar, which all to suggest that anti-Black racism and racial violence correlate directly with the expansion and the greed of racial capitalism. For example, in Myanmar, before it became just a genocide against purely Muslims, it was the cause of accessing arable land in the Rohingya state. And the monk and the state itself utilize the religious difference to make the case for citizen and non-citizen, and to continue to expel Muslims since the 1970s in Burma or Myanmar. So whether this expansion is persuaded by white European or a person of color is not the issue here. The issue here is anti-Black racism is the pillar for expansion of capitalism itself that is disregarded human lives and the natural world. 3, the origin of anti-Black racism in MENA region is also material, meaning it is class-based attitude, which is to say that during anti-colonial struggle and nation building thereafter, most countries of the region, even though they have banned slavery, but they kept its social structure intact by different means. One of them is their unwillingness to repair the damage slavery inflicted on certain populations, and systematically marginalized social group and excluded them from occupying any mainstream space in society, and even denigrated them to lower strata of racial hierarchy, which is to say the least is purely a European invention when they occupy the region. So this is the same racial hierarchy they have inherited from the colonial order, and at times, and we have to give them credit, they fought against it in many of those North African and Middle Eastern region. And here we have to remind ourselves of the great work of Fanon black skin white masks. So for me, just to close out this brief remark, poverty and unequal access to opportunity continue to be the predominant feature of the life of marginalized people in our region for generation, and it will be for generation to come, unless we grapple with the whole idea of structural racism or systemic racism or racialization, and we connect this, the idea of racialization, to the capitalist project itself, because it is impossible in my brain that to imagine that we could tackle racism without tackling racial capitalism, because they feed into each other, and it just will be impossible to entangle. And we see these attempts happen a lot, like from my home country. A lot of people try to do that for 5 decades and is unsuccessful. Still, we all Black in Sudan, but yet there are hierarchy within the Blacks themselves, and associated directly with rural urban setting, with poverty mainly. So while it's a mindset, but it also is the material conditions. And the only time that the country been able, for example, to fight back, to push back against this racial hierarchy, when they forge massive alliances across racial divide, across urban and rural, and gender and class. That time, the idea of equal citizenship became the feature of movements and of governance. So I will stop here for sake of time, and I will be happy to come back. And thank you.
Thank you so much, El Sadek. Sheikh Nadine Naber goes next. Nadine, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Johnson and the Middle East and North African Studies program. It's an honor to be with all of you, especially El Sadiq, Junaid, and Marwan. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about what anti-Muslim racism is, because the case has been made. I mean, Junaid's work and so much work for several decades. Many of us trying to affirm that it exists and how it works. I'm happy to talk about that in the question answer, but I'm going to focus today on a framing that has been consistent in all of my work on anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism, where I've sought to challenge nation-based frameworks or the assumption that while people living in the Arab region face war on the one hand, and then Arab diasporas in the United States face white supremacy and racism on the other, say as mere impacts or coincidences of war. And I've been arguing that imperial military violence, say, you know, the bombs in Iraq or the bulldozers in Palestine, with what takes place among diaspora communities, say the Muslim ban, anti-Muslim hate crimes, FBI raids, surveillance, that both of these experiences of US state violence magnify each other and are moving parts of the same imperial present or spatiotemporal context. And so I'm interested in how anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism, as far as suggesting what framings might be useful, that the framework of imperialism, really. Although imperial violence, you know, has different agendas and impacts communities in different ways and to different degrees, and might even operate for different purposes in different contexts. So this framework then assumes that anti-Muslim racism, so in order to, you know, sort of apply this framework, I thought I would mention that, of course, there are many interconnected genealogies of anti-Muslim racism. And I think sometimes we, including me, reify the logic of the empire by reinforcing this concept Muslim or Muslims when we're trying to resist anti-Muslim racism. But I want to caution us that, of course, there are, you know, many types of Muslims. And when we say anti-Muslim racism, sometimes we might have been referring to people who are not Muslim, but get hailed into the logic of anti-Muslim racism. And I'm talking specifically about histories of anti-Arab racism in the US that were consolidated post-1967, especially when the US officially consolidated its alliance with Israel. And we saw the idea of the Palestinian Arab terrorist and that morphing into the Muslim terrorist. And of course, sometimes it was the Arab Muslim terrorist. You know, we saw that then with the period of the Iranian Revolution. And so when we think about the first Gulf War of the 90s, that was the first time that Arab immigrant communities experienced systematic patterns of racism. So just to kind of push home this idea that about the diaspora and the Arab region in North Africa existing in the same spatiotemporal context, that's what I'm referring to. And at that time we saw fires that destroyed Arab American businesses, public beatings, hate crimes, firebomb attacks. You know, that was all right around the first Gulf War. So that's just my first point. And I'm just gonna make one other point. Well, I guess within my first point, I was also gonna just affirm that it's the context of Palestine that really brings this point home. When we think about, say, the 1990s Oslo Accords, which many of us call the normalization of colonization, which was obscured through the rhetoric of the peace process. When we think of that period, the US created a list of foreign terrorist organizations, which reinforced anti-Muslim racism in terms of like what groups were listed on that. And many of the groups are groups that were critical of the Oslo Accords, and that justified the targeting of Arab American activist movements that were critical of the Oslo process. So again, just wanted to uplift that the repression of Palestine activism and the way that anti-Muslim and anti-Arab racism works to repress that activism is directly tied up with different events taking place around you know, the US empire's commitment to its agenda in Palestine. And then my second point is just around, you know, I mean, of course, I didn't make these ideas up. They come from collective thinking, and especially the field of critical ethnic studies, where scholars have been challenging the domestic versus international framing. And then being in conversation with folks who work on anti-Muslim racism to think about that challenge and how it's relevant to think about anti-Muslim racism, and just challenging the idea of here versus there or domestic versus global, because what it does is it leads us to say that religious tolerance is then a solution for the Muslim ban, or that the problem is individualized acts of violence like hate crimes. So that's how we, think about, rather than thinking about war, right, as the problem, the war on terror, et cetera. And so then I'll just jump to, the framework coming from critical ethnic studies, the framework of endless war, that we need to then look at the foundations of the United States rooted in settler colonialism, and having a character that's expansionist, which extends from the nature of the United States nation state as founded in settler colonialism. And so that's kind of where I come from around thinking of, and also drawing on what El-Sadiq said about, about racial capitalism, and thinking of military industry together colliding with, this idea of creating the Muslim as a viable threat to justify weapons productions or global neoliberal economic policies. And so then we can say that anti-Muslim racism is a global structure that helps sustain US empire. And we can even take it and expand it to how it's interconnected with the problem of mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex, right? Whether we're talking about the CIA's secret prisons in Egypt, or we're talking about support for authoritarian regimes like Sisi's and their policing, mass policing and mass incarceration, or we're talking about the military and US police sharing technologies like showing up to push homeless women, Black women out of their home in where they were sitting in Oakland, California, using military equipment like tanks, or SWAT teams to, target local Black and brown communities in the US. And so closing out then, I'll just put out a list of 3 frameworks that can help us, think and continue to develop our more like transnational analysis. And one I don't have time for, which is transnational feminist anti-imperialism, helps us get at how this global violence that I'm referring to relies on and necessitates heteropatriarchy and sexualized violence. So I think that's essential if we're going to talk about racism. We can't really separate those issues. The second is a framework that I drew upon in my book, Arab America, that comes from Black British cultural studies around diasporas of empire, which I find to be a really useful framework of thinking how some communities form alliance and a sense of commonality with each other, not necessarily because of their relationship to their shared homeland, but because of their relationship to each other in a context where they've been constructed as the enemy within. And then third, I'm now writing using the framework of decolonial feminist abolition, which gets at what I mentioned earlier around the interconnections between policing and militarism, and how we really, I'm suggesting, need to think through the framework of joint struggle, so that we can, so more and more people can be free, basically. So that, I think that a lot of these questions haven't yet been answered, but if feminist abolitionists like Mariam Kaba are saying, can we build a world where prisons will no longer be fathomable? I'm interested in whether we can build a world where US-led militarism and militarism is incomprehensible. So what would it mean to really think about these in relation with each other, and this journey, to think about how do we want to live better and live in better relations with each other so that all life, is valued. And if we're talking about, immigrant communities, how do we do that with accountability to Indigenous communities here, that, the lands that we're being brought to in one way or another. And so how do we basically, think about a world without policing and militarism that's accountable to the struggle of settler colonialism here, you know, when we make arguments for like welcoming immigrants. So I'll end there, and I'm really looking forward to Junaid and hearing the discussion.
Thank you so much, Nadine. Junaid, your turn.
Thank you. Thanks to Rebecca Johnson for organizing this, Danny Postal, Marwan Guredi. I'm really excited to be in conversation with my two co-panelists who have already said such remarkable comments, and I just want to build on them as best I can. I also do take this moment of and this call to sort of decolonize our systems of knowledge very seriously, and I think this is a good moment for us to be building on how to think through global racial formation, global white supremacy, and that's already happening in the comments already. And finally, I want to acknowledge, as I began, that yesterday was the death anniversary of Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, also known as Malcolm X. And it's not only because I'm teaching the autobiography this week and I've been teaching about the Nation of Islam in my classes for the last week, but I think the kinds of things that we can learn from Malcolm's teachings and thinking offers much to us even in this conversation. So I had like 15 points and I'm going to reduce them to like 3. And so the first thing that I want to sort of get us to think about, which is what we are doing in this space, what we do at the university, what we do in the classroom, which is how we think about race, racism, white supremacy in the area studies formation to begin with, right? And when we're thinking about decolonizing these knowledge formations, I mean, the last couple of decades, particularly in area studies from Middle Eastern studies, South Asian studies, Latin American studies, at least, the formations that I read, and of course, Caribbean studies, there's been a move to literally take that notion of decolonization to think through the colonial imperial formations within area studies. And one of the things that I've often sort of thought through is how it is that race and racism often falls out of those conversations. And to push it even further, and I think this is something that's been happening in the last couple of years in interesting fields like international relations and political science, where there's a conversation about the white supremacist foundations of those fields, right? So when we think about area studies as a particular formation that comes out of the United States 20th century history, it is organized around the mid 20th century, the State Department's input or impetus to sort of create the Title VI centers from which knowledge is organized. That part of what we have to think through is how this was implicated and how it continues to implicate, despite our critiques, in a kind of white supremacist formation. So what does that mean? And so what I want us to rehearse a little bit is and I think Nadine and Al-Sadek have said this so kind of beautifully, but I think in the realm of knowledge formations, right, we often look to say, okay, the way that the US understands regions like MENA are through colonial frameworks. So when we decolonize those colonial frameworks, that we're working against that kind of power structure in that way, right? That knowledge is excavated from those places over there. And that in essence, once we've done that, we have a cleaner, purer form of the way we study, the way we do research. And I want to question that. And I want us to sort of think through even what we mean by what I'm saying is the white supremacist foundations of how those things are implicated in ideas of domination, ideas of all sorts of things in terms of the capture of knowledge, information, etc. I see I've already gone through 5 minutes, so I should probably get to my next point, which is what does this look like, right? And I think just to kind of give a different twist to Nadine's examples and Al-Sadiq's examples, which I think is implicit in what they already said, which is how we think about the war on terror. As we approach 20 years of the war on terror, the global war on terror, how can we think about places like Afghanistan, Iraq, the United States, Indonesia, Malaysia, right? India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Syria, Yemen, all of these places and more are implicated in what we call the war on terror. But yet the area studies framework would have us see those things as intellectually compartmentalized, right? And I'm not against some things about that, or let me clarify. I'm not against the area studies framework in the sense of we need to know, for example, we need to have certain kinds of language training. And I myself, when I was in graduate school, I was a product of area studies. But I was also very much thinking about ethnic studies, about race studies, about how do we think beyond the confines of areas. If I wanted to study, as I did in my book, my first book, Pakistani working class immigrants, what does it mean to go back to home countries, to start that study in Pakistan, to look at different places in that migration and how that's a continuum of racial formation that's not just in one place, but that it's happening all over that sort of migratory pathway, right? So that even to go back to the example of the global war on terror, we have to think through both against areas, but through areas, right? Through notions of diaspora, internationalism, transnationalism. And when I say internationalism, not only in the sense of the international, but the kinds of things that Nadine and Al-Sadiq are referring to in terms of political resistance, social movements that are anti-imperial and anti-colonial in nature, and what that looks like on the ground, right? So part of how I think, in terms of wrapping up some of my points here, one of the ways that I think is really fruitful, and that's already been sort of mentioned, is how to think through concepts like anti-Blackness, the settler colonial critique, indigenous critique, in the context of areas, particularly again, when we're thinking about Blackness as a global paradigm and indigeneity as a global paradigm, right? When we talk about indigeneity as a global paradigm, it disrupts not only the way we think about settler colonialism in the first place, it forces us to wrestle with history in a different way, right? What does indigeneity mean in a place like Myanmar, right? What does it mean both from the kinds of on the ground autochthonous communities that are claiming a kind of identity around that, but then how is it that states are also thinking about it? And these are not, one of the kind of pushbacks one always hears is that Junaid, Al-Sadiq, and Nadine, aren't these really US paradigms that you're talking about? But what I would like us to push to think about is how these kinds of concepts that we're talking about sometimes in a US context, what do they look like in these other contexts? They are not necessarily the same. And part of the work that we need to do intellectually as academics, as students, et cetera, is to ask those questions and to find answers, to find that evidence to say, okay, race looks like this in other contexts. In the MENA context, race looks like this. in the MENA context, white supremacy looks like this. And all those things have different answers. That doesn't mean that there isn't a continuity of these terms and these concepts. So I'm going to wrap it up there because I know there's a lot of stuff that's on the table, and hopefully we can continue this lively conversation.
Junaid, thank you so much. What I'd like to ask our panelists to do next is perhaps to very briefly, 2 to 3 minutes each, to engage with what each other has said. So more specifically, I'm going to ask sort of a narrower question. Al-Sadiq, you spoke about institutional racism versus systemic or structural racism. How would that jive with a sort of an epistemology to study racialization that cuts across categories and boundaries, right? What does indigeneity mean in the context of how does it cut across institutional racism, structural racism on the one hand, I mean, institutional racism on the one hand and structural racism on the other hand, particularly that sometimes this language risks being completely co-opted by racial capitalism itself, right? This is, I always remember Stuart Hall saying, global capitalism works through a variety of local capitals. It adapts to local conditions extremely well, right? So can you make a few comments about what Junaid said in terms of cutting across not areas, not between areas, but through areas and within areas?
Brilliant question. I think both Nadine and Junaid put the terms in more salient way. I mean, our world is more complicated, and issues related to racialization is also complicated. But what I'm trying to suggest that I agree that there are multiple frameworks we could look through it. But since 1980s, we have this is my argument. I'm not necessarily, I'm happy to disagree with or others disagree with me. That neoliberalism became the pinnacle of imperialism itself. I will take it further than Lenin that imperialism is a kind of the higher stage of capitalism. I think neoliberalism transformed the way in which our individual lives, community lives, nation state, and global relation. And it does so by even challenging and changing those concepts. So the concept of racialization, if we don't understand where it emerged, it's very hard for us actually to disentangle it from the racial capitalism itself. So, of course, racism and racial prejudice existed for a long period of time. However, the group of regions, what have you, that give it more salient notion and materiality is the European colonization. But even though it existed before, so and in relation to indigeneity, for example, you know, as an indigenous person myself, I never see myself as an indigenous, I never been recognized as an indigenous person, because the European invention of indigeneity itself is a very co-opted. I asked my mother, who's 78 years old, she has fourth grade education. I asked her, do you think you are an indigenous person, for example? She said, I've been here, meaning Northern Sudan, for as far as I know, for 6,000 years. And I have these marks in my face and this tattoo in my lips to demonstrate otherwise. So I'm like, is this old woman could explain what even European failed to see indigeneity? So, and just to come to your questions, I'm not sure if I'm not sure if the formation of racial capitalism and keep changing feature of it is actually risk the distinction between institutional and structural racism. I mean, today we have very few examples of institutional racism, and it became so obvious. But systemic racism, on the other hand, is really difficult. It's really difficult to see, especially in our part of the world. So I know the question is compound, and my answer is also going to different direction, but I will suggest finally one maybe way in which we can see through, cutting through all these concepts, that in our struggle for a better human society, whether that home, MENA, whether that in the diaspora, whether that we're in our new adapted homes in the United States, the concept that Nadine brought in is very important to understand. Without this solidarity across this group, not all people of color are anti-imperialists, for example. So they could be the vehicle for war as well, even Muslims or even Arabs, Anyway, but what I'm trying to say, it has to be based on understanding class and class struggle in itself. And this is not in a limited version of the 1950s or 60s. We have to widen it because we are part of working class as well. People in universities and colleges, that wasn't the case, So I think reaffirming how this concept operates within the hegemony of neoliberalism is very important for us, because we find ourselves often like struggling. We support one thing that does the same thing we try to undo. Like how we think about that, and I think it's not an individual pursuit, it's rather is a collective intellectual pursuit that have to engage with the impacted community itself. I hope I get to part of the question. It's very complicated. Thank you.
So thank you, El Sadiq. So Nadine, I would like to ask you to comment on what El Sadiq just said. One of the most interesting things to me in what you said, as someone who's rather familiar with your previous work, is the language of almost that sort of a political economic language of racism and racialization, less so than sort of concerns with representation, with constructions of racial groups and racial hierarchies. So I know these do not sort of exclude each other or anything, but could you frame your comments on perhaps on this access towards what El Sadiq just said?
Yeah, thank you so much, Marwan. I really appreciate that. There's so much on the table. Maybe I'll just dive into the discussion on solidarity because I think it's from a particular analysis of oppression around the structural, like you said, Marwan, that can lead to what El Sadiq was referring to and all of us earlier about solidarity, because it's on the basis of alliance around an understanding that the structures that are oppressing one community are intertwined with the structures oppressing another. And the way that I've been thinking about that is around challenging the idea that solidarity might be based on an understanding of similarity, but instead interconnection. And what I mean by that is, like if you think of the struggle over Palestine in relation to Black struggle in the US in relation to policing, oftentimes, or one approach is to say that, oh, look, Gaza looks like Ferguson, so we should, align. And I very much agree with that. I mean, they are similar and we should align. But I think that reinforces the logic that all of us are critiquing of, whether Junaid was talking about area studies or we're talking about nation-based frameworks. It reinforces this idea of like bounded nation states. And so instead, when we think about how, some of the Ferguson police, St. Louis police were trained, in Israel, say, or we think of military spending being removed from communities and put into the war machine. And even, I want to bring in the indigenous struggle here around, because we often, and maybe this was inspired by something Junaid said about the frameworks that were the conventional area studies frameworks lead to certain focusing on some things while obscuring others. So we could think of, when we think of militarization, do we think about the militarization of native land in the US? Do we think about the North Dakota pipeline? Do we think about, military forces, going after indigenous activists trying to protect their land with weapons, military grade weapons? So it's just to say that then using that sort of joint struggle framework, which again is different than the similarity framework, I think that's a useful framework to think that, and I'm not the first person to say this, and I don't remember how other people have said this. I think Nick Estes said this in a different way, that, and I know that, the movement for Black Lives, some of the folks who went to Palestine, I think it was the Dream Defenders said this, which is the empire connects us already. So we just need to catch up, and so it's just a challenge on thinking about how our struggles are often, maybe what it is imperialist logic, or the logic of the US nation state, frame our struggles as if they're separate, right? Frame them through this nation state framework. And it kind of reminds me of when we think about, what was I going to say? Even I forgot, but that's okay. Yeah, but it's just to say that, by approaching that with a critical lens, and challenging that framing, there's a lot more interconnection than, and then it also can challenge the whole like oppression Olympics as well. Oh, I know what I was going to say, that, we can even, when we say the nation state, of course, there are different nation states depending on the context. The US nation state isn't the same all the time. So we think of like the post like liberal multiculturalist period. We can think of like how Arab American issues were added to the melting pot after September 11th, and that's an example of that struggles are separate, that it's like only when the US says there's a crisis does that issue become significant, right? The attacks on, say, Arab American activists, which have been happening since the 70s. But it's only after 9/11 that it becomes a thing. So that's kind of like that crisis-based inclusion, which I think we're also challenging in what we're saying. So I'll just leave it at that. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you. I thought it happened when Iron Man said shawarma for the first time to a Hollywood audience. So Junaid, I have in the interest of time, my question to you in commenting on what both El Sadiq and Nadine said is going to be very, very specific. What do area studies need to learn from ethnic studies, or what do ethnic studies need to learn from area studies in terms of language? You focused on language. Is there a specific concept that you think one of these formations need to import and borrow and adapt from the other?
Well, I think it goes back. Well, okay, let me step back a little bit, because I wanted to sort of pick up on something you asked regarding to Al Sadiq, which is, when we think about the university is already part of racial capitalism, right? And so I think in many ways, the way we think about area and ethnic studies, and even the university logic of area and ethnic studies, is areas away, ethnic here. But what American studies scholars have been doing also for the last several decades, more like the last 30, 40 years, is making the argument for what happens when you make a place like the United States or North America in a different kind of conception, an area in relationship to the way we think about MENA or other parts of the world, right? And so when you de-provincialize where you are, when you're in the empire, and you de-provincialize that way of thinking, that shifts how, okay, so when you go abroad and you go to another place and you learn, I'm an anthropologist, so the classic anthropological training is when you go abroad, you learn a language, you find a place, you embed yourself in that place. And I'm using the militarized language on purpose, because we have to question how those methodologies are not only simultaneously, when again, in my example, when I talked about the war on terror, all those various places around the world, including where we are now, what that has done, and I'm going to use this word because you said political economy and it gave me an opening. What it has done ideologically is it has created what we're calling anti-Muslim racism. That is the idea that the Muslim is the figure of the Muslim is a foil in all those places for how there are, that there's justifications and forms of coercion and consent around violence and war, right? And so that particular way of thinking, all of this stuff needs to be disrupted in area studies and in ethnic studies. I don't think this is either or. This is both. But I do think that in I don't know if this is a classroom question, but I think this is also more of a scholarly thing. What does it mean to read across fields, across disciplines? What if area studies? What if somebody in MENA taught a class called Anti-Muslim Racism, right? What would that class look like? And I don't know if there's a class at Northwestern like that, but I'm just imagining that most likely there's not. And simultaneously in ethnic studies, what would it look like to teach a class that is more typically a MENA topic, right? So I think those by hybridizing and mixing and mashing up all of those kinds of things, that's what we have to do. You know, going back to your original question, epistemologically, we have to unravel a lot of our romantic training, our liberalist training, and we have to really go back to some of the other traditions that emerge out of anti-colonial epistemologies, anti-imperial epistemologies.
Great, thank you. So I just want to remind everybody, all our participants, that the Q&A box is open. We already have several great questions, and with Rebecca's help, I'm gonna try to synthesize them so that we sort of, gather 2 or 3 questions that have one thematic, direction to them, to have more time for detailed answers. So the first set of questions that has come up is, to what extent can we understand race in the Arab world, North Africa, the Middle East, prior to colonialism, outside of the structure of knowledge of imperialism, outside of the experience of colonialism? Can we, and if you think we can, how? I think El Sadiq should take a first stab at that.
Sure. Yeah, it's very interesting questions. And just to start by saying that oftentimes in our present day, we in the Arab region, we try to evade and dodge this question a lot. We are not racist. We don't have anti-Black. We don't harbor it as such, which is not true. Not true because for a couple of reasons. One of them, as I suggested before, is really hard to understand anti-Blackness or anti-dark skin phenotypes, what have you, or linguistic or regional, without understanding what does racial capitalism do to us. And in our present day, how neoliberalism bit us against each other, whether here in the extension of the diaspora or back home. Historically, the genealogy of race and racism and the invention of race is not only attributed to colonialism per se, but is of course colonialism reinforced. Our region experience, as I mentioned in my remarks, and this is very well supported by historians, but most of us will study the transatlantic. Nobody wants to study the Indian Ocean slavery because it is critical to our, challenging us as well. But if we just know that is preceded the European slavery by 1,000 years, I mean, this is remarkable. This should make us rethink And I think what Nadine and Junaid talking about it is the same idea. The empire at the time, it wasn't over here, it was over somewhere else. And that empire also attributed to the expansion of racism. Militarism is not a new phenomenon of the 21st century. Militarism is always exists. Militarism is one of the pinnacle of the feature of how racial capitalism operates in those spaces. And therefore, it pushes subjugating other people. If we just move out of, let's say, our region and we hop into South America, do we understand that Inca also contributed to those sort of things? It is indeed, yes, we love to admire the Inca, I am, but it also comes with other territory, or the Aztec, or I'm big fan and big students of the Chinese culture. But it does come 3,000 years ago with other problems. So what I'm trying to tell the person who asked the questions is the racism in the Arab world accumulated and emerged over time, but is solidified, and it became salient and became very strong in a way in which our region became extremely Eurocentric. We cannot even think beyond Eurocentrism. I'm a big fan of Samir Amin, and I will call all the audience, if they didn't have the time to read Samir Amin, Eurocentrism, I think that's one of the foundational book, because it deconstructs these ideas. We are, and as a region, we are at the face of the empire and the imperialism attack. At the same time, we are in the service of the empire itself. We are the subject of the region, are the victims of Islamophobia, and most of the regime in the region most likely supported Islamophobia. Like how we disentangle those. This is not an easy exercise, but to say simply, we are not racist, or we are not the concept that I brought in the beginning, our whiteness is not seen. We are beneficiary of whiteness, whether that in a region or even in the United States, And I will close with this. I will just try to attribute something to Jack Shaheen said, that I think anti-Arab racism, it really dates back to the beginning of the 1900s. It's not a new phenomenon. I think from 1918, I borrow a quote from him. I'm a big fan of his work in a cultural realm, that if we see the movie Tarzan of the apes, there we see actually the manifestations, the first manifestation of anti-Arab and by extension anti-Muslim sentiment in the United States, but it also is set on top of each of anti-Blackness. And Shaheen makes me go back to study the presidents of United States, and I look at the 10th president, Taylor of United States, to see at that time emerged this idea that we should not be anti-Muhammadins or anti-Muslims. So the things goes really back, but I think in cinematography, we could see when actually anti-Arabs and anti-Muslim emerged. So to close by saying that, I hope that my answer satisfies the person who asked. I think the origin of racism or anti-Blackness, in particular in our region, in Arab world, is emerged from the working of the empire itself, and is predated. Let's be clear on this: transatlantic slavery. So we don't blame everything else in the Europeans. Of course, they have their hand, but it's not. So we don't wash our hand out of it. We are implicated with us. I don't want to judge the theology, but our theology should be contested. And decolonizing the knowledge of an epistemology of how we interpreted our holy books is also important for us to understand, because, for such a long time, and I'm sorry to take so much time here, for so long time, just like the church was the protector of slavery, also our imams were the protector of slavery.
Thank you, Sadiq. So, not to mention the Ottoman slave trade, right? In between the Indian slave trade and the transatlantic one. We have another set of questions that focus on social justice activism within diasporic communities. So I have two that I'm going to ask. One, the first one for Nadine, and the second one for Junaid. The first one is for Nadine. How can Arab Americans reconcile with sort of the legacy of anti-Blackness in the Arab world without having to adopt what could be a colonial perspective for doing that, right? So it's a connection between sort of how you reconcile with long-held historical trajectories of racism without using categories that were originally imposed on you, right, from the outside. Any answer?
Okay. The way I'm reading the question is basically, how do you address internal hierarchies and forms of violence within Arab American communities or Arab communities without reinforcing anti-Arab racism or Orientalism? Is that kind of the question, would you say?
I believe so, yes.
And really, my brief answer would be that you do so without reducing the complex power dynamics within our communities to ahistoric problems of culture or religion. And so I think you basically use what everyone's been saying at this panel, what El Sadiq just said about, and Marwan added to about, I mean, that was a perfect answer really to this question, which is in every instance, we need to situate the problem of anti-Blackness within the historical and political conditions out of which it was produced. And of course, there are cultural sensibilities and religious sensibilities that do shape anti-Blackness. It's not to say it's all, you know, political economy or, you know, but it's how we talk about cultural sensibilities. How do we talk about religious sensibilities? Are they ahistoric, timeless? Are Arabs born to act a certain way? Or are they, you know, produced? And it doesn't mean that, you know, we don't take responsibility for it, or we're not going to be accountable to our behaviors or practices, right? But it just means that the analysis of how it was produced. And I know that I would add to that I also always insist, kind of like what Sadiq also did, I think, is that, you know, to couple this discussion with histories of resistance to racism from within the communities and our histories, and avoid these blanket, like, you know, Arabs are racist, you know. But again, we're not resisting that to say we're not racist, because then we're just doing the same thing of reactionary defensive stances that are also, to me, Orientalist, or what is it? Anti-Orientalist. You know, they're two parts of the same whatever coin or problem. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. So the second sort of very related question is to Junaid. How can we decolonize our understanding of race while we are products of Western systems of education, at least most of us attending today, which, you know, that system of education is part of the larger formation of racial capitalism, right? I couldn't help when I read this question. So as a kid growing up in Lebanon, I discovered race while watching an episode of Roots when Kunta Kinte's toes get cut because he tried to run away. And I remember crying, and I remember the conversation was, oh my God, this is awful, but we don't have this here, right? And so you become aware of race at the same time as you deflect it as an issue for you. So how do we do that? Or how do we avoid doing what I just said I did?
Well, I mean, I don't know, because I think that this is the challenge for us in a way that we can't, I mean, even in this line of questioning, you know, I just want to blurt out that race is not transhistorical. It's not something that's universal. It's not always been the same. It's not, our pre-modern versions of it is not the same thing that is the modern version. The thing that you grew up with in Lebanon, or very specifically in Beirut, is not even the same thing that we might be talking about here in the Midwest. And so I think what we need to do here is say, I'm not sure about the word decolonize here, because I do take decolonization very seriously as an act that goes back to land and particular rights and resources that are not in the liberal framework, that come from indigenous ways of being. But I do think that if I was very simply to answer your question, the way to sort of think about the problem of race and racism is that we need to study it, right? And I know this is a little bit of a cop-out from your question, because you want and whoever was asking those series of questions want the golden answer, but we need to study it. We need to study the transatlantic slave trade. We need to study and understand the relationship between North America, South America, the Caribbean, and Africa, right? Because I think often when we think of slavery, we think it happened in the Western Hemisphere, but it also happened just precisely in the way you were talking about in Africa, right? And here I want to give a shout out to my colleague Jemima Pierre, who wrote an anthropologist who wrote a piece in Current Anthropology that just came out earlier this year, which turns the lens of racialization around in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, that say, how is it that Africans were racialized in that process, right? So when we start asking questions like that, it not only illuminates broader questions of how we have to think, in other words, epistemology, how we have to think about those knowledge formations that we already have, but what is it that we've already been problematically engaging in, right?
Yes.
And so one of the narratives, just one last point, which is one of the narratives that's a classic anthropological way that Africa is studied, that it's always studied through social organization, right? Through kinship. And kinship and social organization fundamentally get us back to these colonial and racial and imperial paradigms, right? Because these were ways of knowing these populations to say they're different and they're on this kind of a primordial line towards progress and civilization, right? And so unpacking and undoing that knowledge also means we got to study it, right? We got to study it to say, okay, so what is it that we are going to do different now, right?
So learn the thing as it is before you criticize it, deconstruct it, and build something else. Thank you. So we have just about 6 minutes left, and we have several questions that revolve around issues of institutional change. So if we are to truly institutionalize sort of the intellectual challenge to the foreign versus the domestic, to the sort of the global versus the local, to cut across category as opposed to reify them. If we are to hire, one question is about, how Arab Americans, for example, are defined in the US institutionally, and how that may affect how you hire people for programs in ethnic studies or Middle Eastern studies, right? How do we make sure that these issues, these ideas, these notions, these intellectual developments have institutional life? Who would like to take that? Nadine, would you like to start?
Sure. I mean, I could say, we can challenge our universities to not, operate according to the conventional categories. And I think there are possibilities, which we've done at University of Michigan, creating an Arab and Muslim American Studies program in ethnic studies, all the hiring we see in Asian and Asian American Studies programs of people who do Arab American. So I think, part of it is challenging our universities and providing useful frameworks for the universities to use. I mean, we have to do that work, of creating these framings for our campuses. So I think that's a really, really important to basically, I mean, sometimes we just have to be patient and do the work of explaining why what we see happening to Muslim Americans is a form of racism connected to all these other forms of racism that are more commonly understood. And I think one way of doing it, for me, on a very basic level, when I deal with issues like this at a university level, I just start from the premise that there are many racisms. There isn't just one racism. I know that's so simple, but it just needs to be said that racism isn't always about, assumptions based on phenotype, or I mean, that's a whole can of worms I'm not going to get into, but just to be, we all need to have the language to explain to others, how anti-Muslim racism operates. And that's really just been an incredibly important skill set and tool that I've seen many of us use to make these administrative changes. So I think that, I'll just leave it at that so others could have a chance to talk about this.
Thank you. Sadiq, do you have any thoughts on how to make institutional structures catch up with the world as we know it and the world as we study it?
From personal practice in University of California, Berkeley, and the institute we built, the Othering and Belonging Institute, we think we need to do two things simultaneously. We develop a framework called targeted universalism, which you target the universal with a particularity. So think of it this way. If we would like to uplift, let's say, Muslim Americans, right? But if you imagine, if you go after the people with disability to uplift them, most likely you will lift Muslim Americans. So the larger frame, you target the most marginalized group in terms of like hiring, let's be specific to this, or even recruitment to a new generation of scholar. The more you target it, the most marginalized, the most unrepresented, the most excluded, it will already open up to the other concept. And I use another concept, I call it the glocal. I don't recognize there's global. I do not recognize there is local. There is glocal, because my behavior here in Berkeley, California is really impacting somebody in Malaysia and vice versa. There is no way to stop this in the era of neoliberalism. But if I may, I want to just say one other thing about Arab Muslims. I try in my work to avoid connecting these two together for obvious reason of Orientalist work, because they made sure that when we say Arab, people understand Muslim, and when we say Muslim, people understand Arabs. And they done such a phenomenal work, white supremacists and Islamophobes, is to target one group and to inflict the pain in other groups. So I love what Junaid says. We really need to study those things. So for me, I challenge by the way, my mother tongue is Arabic. I went to education in Arabic, and till very recent, when I migrated to the United States, I started to change my identity, but I used to say I'm Arab. I'm Afro-Arab, and this identity should be held, because I deeply believe is even a matter of fact. There is more Arabs in Africa than in the Middle East. But we kind of swept under the rug in terms of even hiring. When I look at Arab institutions here or in Paris or what have you, I don't find somebody from Mauritania. Why is that? Is a big problem. Forget about North African. I'm talking about, Sub-Saharan African. They are Arabs. And I want to just share with you that a Sudanese scholar, a boy, his name is, why I'm forgetting his name? Ahmed Abdul-Al. He studied something, what he called it, he created the school of thoughts called the jungle and the desert school, Madrasa al-Ghaba al-Sahra. And he referred to these people. This in 1961, when he did his PhD on Yeats to combat the British colonialism. So he brought back to Sudan this idea, and they developed an institution, they call it the Afro-Asian institutions, to study this type of distinction. However, because we are so colonized in our mind, and we don't do any decolonization work, and we don't study as Junaid suggested, we fail as, let's say, the Sudanese, but the extension, our neighbors in the Middle East or West Asia, we've been incapable of understanding even work like the work of Edward Said, Orientalism, or cultural imperialism. We are unable. Maybe the subcontinent Indians, they've been able to benefit from it scholarly more than us in the Arab world. Like we use it just as a political tool, but we don't actually use it to enrich our epistemologies and study those kind of very compound features. And I always argue, and I'll close with this, we study race and racism, but we are incapable of taking it further to look in and out, the global idea of racism. And if we do that, as Janice suggested, I think really will be beneficial to us. I agree with Nadine. Arabs, they've been anti-racist for such a long time. Not all Arabs. And Arab being racist, not all Arab for a long period of time, like any other group of people, because we are not homogenized people. We are Muslims or Arabs or Africans. We are not homogenized. We are just like any other people. We're going through this. But what we lack is, I think, to study those phenomena based on our understanding of them at the given historical moment. So I call for all of us to keep pushing the boundaries of locals in order for us to study this phenomena back home without just borrowing from Western institutions, right? So how we develop that and how we can do that. I hope that's kind of getting to the question.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Yeah, thank you so much, all of you, and thank you to Marwan for curating such a wonderful conversation and showing us, all of you, how these issues are not just scholarly paradigms, but they're based in resource distribution and activist networks, structures of pedagogy in the classroom, and hiring, recruiting graduate students and training graduate students. And so thanks for helping us illuminate all of the corners that are necessary to really have a full discussion. So thank you all, and I hope to see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to everybody.
Pleasure.
To all the attendees with the wonderful questions. It's really wonderful.